1941. Midnight, somewhere west of Ireland. The merchant ships were moving slowly through darkness. No lights, no safety. Only the low sound of engines pushing steel through black water. Only the wind across the decks. Only the cold Atlantic rising and falling around them like something alive. To the men on those ships, the ocean was not empty. It only looked empty. Somewhere beneath the surface, German U-boats were waiting. They did not need to see every ship. They did not need to destroy the whole convoy. They needed one opening, one gap, one escort looking the wrong way, one merchant ship exposed for a few minutes too long. Inside the German submarine, the convoy ahead would have looked like prey. Slow, heavy, vulnerable, ships carrying the lifeblood of Britain. Food, fuel, weapons, ammunition, men, everything the island needed to keep fighting. The U-boat commander had waited for this kind of moment. The Atlantic was dark. The weather was rough. The convoy was moving through dangerous water. And somewhere inside the submarine, men were preparing to strike from beneath the surface. This was the terror of the Battle of the Atlantic. Death often came without warning. No visible army, no battlefield line, no enemy flag appearing over a hill. Just a torpedo track in black water, then fire, then men in the ocean. But around that convoy, in the darkness, other men were watching too. Canadian sailors, on small escort ships, corvettes, destroyers, convoy escorts climbing wave after wave in weather that seemed built to break men down. Cold spray over the decks, ice on the rails, eyes burning from exhaustion, hands gripping wet steel, and somewhere below them, an enemy they could not see. The Germans expected fear. They expected chaos. They expected convoys to scatter. They expected merchant ships to become isolated, burning targets in the dark Atlantic. But the Canadians stayed with the ships. That was their task. Not glory, not headlines, not a clean battle with a visible enemy. Their job was to stay, to guard the slow ships, to listen to the water, to turn toward danger when every instinct told a man to turn away from it. Then came the sound, not the explosion, not yet. Something colder, more patient. A signal crossing the black water, a search for something hidden beneath the sea. Ping, the U-boat had come to hunt the convoy. But now, somewhere above it, Canadian sailors were hunting back. The Battle of the Atlantic was not a side story. It was a war for survival. Britain needed the sea. Every ship mattered. Every convoy mattered. Every ton of food, fuel, steel, ammunition, aircraft parts, and military equipment had to cross water that Germany wanted to turn into a graveyard. The German plan was brutal in its simplicity. Cut the lifeline. Sink the ships. Starve Britain of the supplies needed to keep fighting. Break the Atlantic bridge between North America and Europe before Allied power could fully gather. The U-boat was built for that kind of war. It did not need to defeat a battleship in open combat. It did not need to fight like a surface fleet. Its power came from invisibility, from waiting, from stalking, from attacking at the moment the target felt least prepared. Then came the Wolfpack. German submarines working together against convoys crossing the ocean. One boat could find a convoy. Others could be called toward it. And in darkness, multiple submarines could attack from different directions, spreading confusion through ships, already struggling with weather, navigation, and fear. For the men inside the U-boats, this strategy could create terrifying confidence. The ocean was enormous. The convoys were slow. The merchant ships were vulnerable. And early in the war, Allied escort coverage was often stretched thin. A U-boat commander could look at the Atlantic and see opportunity everywhere. Black water, long nights, storms, gaps in protection, convoys that had to keep moving even when danger was known to be near. But confidence at sea is always fragile, because the ocean that hides one man can also hide another. The U-boat crews knew destroyers were dangerous. They knew escorts could kill them if they were found. But the logic of Wolfpack warfare depended on one belief, that the convoy system could be overwhelmed, that escorts could be stretched too thin, that fear could break discipline, that the Atlantic was wide enough for the hunters to keep finding openings. This is where Canada enters the story. Canada did not begin the war as a giant naval power. It did not enter the Atlantic with endless ships or perfect equipment, but geography placed Canada directly on the route out between North America and Britain. Canadian ports mattered. Canadian sailors mattered. Canadian escorts would have to sail into the Black Atlantic again and again because the convoy lifeline could not be allowed to break. For the German U-boats, the Atlantic was a hunting ground. For Britain, it was survival. For Canada, it became a duty that could not be refused. If the Atlantic lifeline broke, Britain could be strangled without Germany ever landing on its shores. And that meant Canadian sailors were about to enter a war where the enemy was usually invisible. The weather was merciless, and the ocean itself seemed to belong to the submarines. Canada entered the Battle of the Atlantic because geography left no other choice. The ocean road between North America and Britain ran through Canadian responsibility. Ships gathered in Canadian ports, convoys formed in Canadian waters, sailors sailed out from Halifax, St. John's, Sydney, and other Atlantic points into a war that did not look like the battlefields of Europe, but mattered just as deeply. At first, the Royal Canadian Navy was small, too small for the size of the war that was coming. The Atlantic was vast, the U-boat threat was growing, and the convoy routes were too important to leave undefended. Canada had to grow quickly. Ships had to be built, crews had to be trained, officers had to learn under pressure, and sailors had to go to sea before everything was perfect. That is one of the most important parts of this story. Canada did not enter the Atlantic as an invincible naval machine. It entered under pressure, with limitations, with shortages, with young sailors learning in some of the harshest conditions on Earth. And still, the convoys had to sail. The comparison matters. The Germans feared British destroyers because they were fast, experienced, and dangerous. They feared Allied aircraft because the sky could expose a submarine before it attacked. They feared convoy coordination because a protected convoy was harder to isolate. But Canadian escorts became dangerous in another way. Persistence. They stayed with the ships, through storms, through ice, through night attacks, through exhaustion, through the terror of not knowing whether the next dark shape beneath the water was a whale, a wave, or a U-boat preparing to fire. For German naval planners, convoys were supposed to be vulnerable. A convoy was slow. It had to protect its weakest ships. It could not turn like a warship. It had to cross thousands of miles while submarines chose the time and place of attack. But the convoy was also a system. And systems can learn. They can adapt. They can absorb fear and keep moving. That is what Canada became part of. Not a single heroic ship defeating the ocean. Not one famous duel that decided the war. But a system of escorts, sailors, signals, sonar, merchant crews, ports, repairs, training aircraft, and endless repetition. A system built to keep the ships moving. The German U-boats could sink ships. They could terrify crews. They could turn the Atlantic into a battlefield of fire and freezing water. But to win strategically, they had to break the lifeline. And Canadian sailors became part of the reason that lifeline kept moving. Canada did not enter the Atlantic as a giant navy. It entered as a country that had no choice but to grow fast. And in the Black Atlantic, that growth would be tested by storms, torpedoes, depth charges, and the enemy beneath the waves. The Canadian ships were small against the Atlantic. That was the first thing the ocean made clear. A corvette could rise on one wave and disappear behind the next. Its bow could climb into darkness, hang for a moment, then slam down hard enough to shake steel, bones, and nerves. The sea did not care that these men were young. It did not care that some had been civilians not long before. It did not care that the enemy was somewhere beneath them. The Atlantic was already an enemy of its own. On board, everything was wet. Decks, ropes, coats, hands, faces. The cold worked its way into the body slowly, then completely. Ice formed on rails. Men stood watch in darkness, staring into a world that offered almost nothing back. Only water, only fog, only the feeling that something beneath the surface might already be watching them. This was the origin of Canada's reputation in the Atlantic. Not glamour, not polished steel, not great battleship duels under clear skies. Endurance. A small ship staying beside a float convoy while the Atlantic tried to tear it apart. A young crew learning to fight an enemy that usually could not be seen. A navy growing while already at war. The enemy beneath the water knew the value of patience. A U-boat did not need to rush. It could wait. It could follow. It could let the convoy move deeper into darkness. It could search for gaps between escorts. It could wait for weather, confusion, or exhaustion to create a weakness. And in the Atlantic, weaknesses always appeared. A ship drifting from formation. An escort pulled away. A signal missed. A night too dark. A sea too rough. But Canadian sailors were learning patience too. They learned to listen. They learned to watch. They learned that the enemy might be nothing more than a sound beneath the ship. A contact. A suspicion. A return on ASDIC. A single pulse moving through black water. That sound became one of the symbols of the Atlantic War. Ping. A question sent into the darkness. Ping. A signal searching for steel beneath the sea. Ping. Somewhere beneath the black water, something was moving. For the U-boat crew below, that sound carried its own terror. It meant the escort was searching. It meant the submarine might no longer be invisible. It meant the convoy was not helpless. Above them were men they could not see, on a ship they might have dismissed as small, rough, and underpowered. But small ships could still kill. Depth charges did not need glamour. They only needed to fall close enough. The Canadian escorts were not perfect. Early in the war, crews faced hard learning curves, equipment limitations, harsh weather, and the pressure of being forced to improve while lives were already at stake. They made mistakes. They suffered losses. They endured storms that made even routine movement dangerous. But they kept sailing. But again and again and again, that persistence is what the U-boats began to meet. Not an invincible navy, not a flawless machine, but a growing force of Canadian sailors who returned to the convoy lanes even after storms, attacks, and funerals. The Atlantic did not become safer quickly. The enemy did not disappear. The Wolfpacks still waited. But the convoys were no longer alone. The small ships faced the deep, and beneath that deep the Wolfpacks were closing. Night again. North Atlantic. A convoy moving slowly through black water. To the German U-boat commander, it was the kind of target the Wolfpacks were built to find. Not one ship. Many. A line of dark shapes spread across the sea, carrying the cargo of survival, food, fuel, steel, ammunition, trucks, men. The material of war moving across water that Germany wanted to control. Inside the U-boat, the attack began before the torpedoes moved. It began with calculation, distance, angle, speed, escort positions, which ship looked vulnerable, which gap might open, which moment might let the submarine strike and vanish. The U-boat commander did not need to destroy the whole convoy. He needed a wound, one ship burning, one ship sinking, one gap in the formation. One moment of fear spreading from vessel to vessel. That was how Wolfpacks worked psychologically, not only by sinking ships, by making every ship believe it might be next. Then the torpedo ran, silent at first, a weapon moving through dark water toward men who could not see it coming. On the merchant ship, life continued for a few more seconds. Engines turning, watchmen scanning, crewmen bracing against the cold, then impact. Fire tore into the night. A ship that had been a shadow became a torch. Flames rose from the waterline. Smoke moved across the convoy. Men were thrown from bunks, ladders, stations, and decks. Some reached lifeboats. Some did not. Some found themselves in the Atlantic, where survival could be measured in minutes. For the German crew, this was success. The convoy had been hit. The Atlantic had opened. The Wolfpack had drawn blood. But success in the convoy war was never simple. Because once the torpedo struck, the escorts turned. Canadian ships began moving toward the danger, not away from it, toward it. This was the moment the U-boat's confidence began to change. The submarine had revealed something, not always its exact position, not enough to guarantee destruction, but enough to bring hunters toward the place where it had attacked. The ocean that hid the U-boat also carried sound, and above the submarine, Canadian sailors were already searching. The convoy could not simply stop. That was part of the agony. The merchant ships had to keep moving. If they scattered too badly, they became easier prey. If they slowed too much, the U-boats gained advantage. If escorts broke formation carelessly, another submarine might find another opening. So the escorts faced impossible choices. Protect the convoy, hunt the submarine, rescue survivors, keep formation. Respond to the next threat that might already be approaching from another direction. There were no clean decisions in the Black Atlantic, only necessary ones. The German Wolfpack expected fear. It expected confusion. It expected the convoy to become vulnerable after the first strike. And fear was there. Confusion was there. Men were dying. Ships were burning. But the convoy did not simply dissolve. The Canadian escorts stayed with it. One ship hunted. Another guarded. Signals moved. Search patterns began. Depth charges were prepared. This was the first battlefield proof of the Atlantic escort war. The U-boats could strike. Cobble they could kill. They could turn the ocean into fire. But every attack risked drawing the escorts down onto them. The hunter could become a contact. The contact could become a target. And the target could become a submarine crew waiting beneath the water for explosions. The U-boats had brought death to the convoy. Now the escorts were bringing death back down into the water. The submarine dived. Above it, the Atlantic closed again. Black water over steel, waves above. Darkness around, silence inside. For the U-boat crew, this was supposed to be escape, dive, evade, disappear, return later, strike again. That was how the ocean was supposed to work. But above them, the Canadian escort had begun searching, not with eyes. The submarine was gone from sight, not with a gun. There was nothing visible to fire at. The search began with sound, a signal sent into the deep, a question thrown into the black water. Ping. Inside the U-boat, men listened. That sound could freeze a crew. It meant the escort was looking. It meant the submarine might be held in the invisible grip of detection. It meant the boat was no longer simply hiding. It was being hunted. A submarine under pursuit becomes a room full of calculations. Depth, speed, battery power. Course changes. How long to stay down. How close the escort might be. Whether the sonar contact was firm or uncertain. Whether the next turn might save them. Whether the next sound would be depth charges rolling into the sea. The Canadian crew above had their own uncertainty. They could not see the U-boat. They did not know every movement beneath them. The Atlantic distorted sound. The ship rose and fell with waves. Men worked through darkness, weather, stress, and imperfect information, but they stayed on the contact. Or tried to. That was the work. Hold the invisible enemy long enough to attack. Then the escort turned. Depth charges were set. Men on deck worked quickly. The ship moved over the suspected position. For a few seconds, everything depended on timing. The submarine's path, the escort's speed, the depth setting, the judgment of men who could not see the enemy they were trying to destroy. Then the charges rolled away, one after another, heavy cylinders disappearing into the sea. The surface closed over them, and below the U-boat crew waited. Waiting was the torture, not knowing whether the explosions would be too far away, close enough to damage, or close enough to kill. The men inside could not run, could not spread out, could not escape the pressure wave if it found them. They could only brace, listen, and hope. Then the Atlantic erupted. Depth charges turned the ocean into a hammer. The submarine shook, lights flickered, men were thrown sideways, pipes strained, loose objects crashed to the deck. The hull groaned under pressure. This was the reversal the Wolfpacks feared. Moments earlier, the U-boat had been the predator. Now it was the thing hiding. The convoy still moved above. The escort still searched. And inside the submarine, the men who had come to kill merchant ships were waiting to learn whether the ocean would kill them first. The Canadian sailors could not always know whether they had succeeded. Sometimes the submarine escaped. Sometimes damage was uncertain. Sometimes the contact was lost. Sometimes the sea swallowed all evidence. But even a failed attack could matter. If the U-boat dived, it lost position. If it stayed down, it lost time. If it abandoned the chase, the convoy lived longer. The U-boat had come to hunt the convoy. Now it was hiding beneath it. The convoy had been hit. A ship was burning. Men were in the water. The night was filled with smoke, oil, fire, and the sound of engines turning through heavy sea. From beneath the Atlantic, the German crews had expected the convoy to weaken. That was the logic of the Wolfpack. Strike once, create fear, force confusion, open gaps, then strike again. But the convoy did not simply break apart. That was the first frustration. The merchant ships kept moving. Slowly, painfully, but moving. Escorts stayed close. Signals passed through darkness. Canadian sailors remained at their stations even as the ocean around them turned into a battlefield. This was the moral turning point of the Atlantic Convoy War. Not a single heroic charge. Not one clean victory. But the decision to keep going when the ocean itself seemed to be warning every man to turn back. The convoy had been wounded, but it was still moving. For the Canadian sailors, the choice was never simple. If a ship was hit, men might be drowning in freezing water. If an escort turned to rescue them, the convoy might become weaker. If it stayed with the convoy, men in the sea might die. If it chased the U-boat, survivors might be left behind. If it stopped, another submarine might be waiting. That was the cruelty of convoy escort duty. Every decision could cost lives. There were no perfect choices, only duties competing with other duties. Protect the convoy, hunt the submarine, save survivors, hold formation, listen for the next contact, prepare for the next torpedo. The Germans expected fear, and fear was there. Of course it was. Only a fool would not be afraid in the Black Atlantic. But fear did not always mean collapse. Sometimes fear became discipline. Sometimes fear became silence. Sometimes fear became men staying at their guns, on their bridge, in their engine rooms, and beside their depth charges because the convoy still had to cross the ocean. They should have broken. They did not. Not because they were untouched by terror. Not because losses did not matter. Not because Canadian sailors were immune to exhaustion, but because the entire Atlantic War depended on a simple, brutal act. Keep the ships moving. For the U-boat crews, this was frustrating. A burning ship should have created disorder. A torpedo strike should have made the convoy easier to tear apart. But escorts still circled. The convoy still held. The sea still carried the ships forward. And every hour the convoy survived was an hour Germany had failed to break the lifeline. This is how endurance becomes a weapon. Not dramatic, not glamorous, but relentless. A convoy crossing the Atlantic did not defeat a Wolfpack in one cinematic moment. It defeated the Wolfpack by continuing. Through storm, through darkness, through loss, through fear. Through another night where the next explosion might come without warning. Canadian sailors did not make the Atlantic safe. No one did, but they helped make it possible. Possible for merchant ships to continue, possible for supplies to arrive, possible for Britain to endure, possible for the war in Europe to keep being fought. The U-boats had expected the Atlantic to break the convoys, but the convoys kept moving, and the Canadian escorts moved with them. The Atlantic War did not stay the same. It adapted. Every convoy taught something. Every loss exposed a weakness. Every attack forced men to ask what had failed, what could improve, and how the next convoy might survive longer. For the Canadian Navy, this learning process was hard, and often paid for in blood. Early escorts faced limited equipment, harsh training demands, inexperienced crews, and ships that were never designed for comfort in the middle of the Atlantic. A corvette could be tough, but tough did not mean easy to live in. Men were wet for days, sick for days, exhausted for days, and still expected to hunt submarines in darkness. But the Canadian escort war changed because it had to. Training improved, coordination improved, equipment improved, convoy tactics improved. The relationship between ships, aircraft, intelligence, signals, and escort groups became more effective over time. The U-boats were not facing the same Navy they had hunted at the beginning of the war. This was tactical adaptation, not one miracle invention, not one magic solution, but many changes accumulating. Better use of ASDIC, better depth charge tactics, improved radar and communications, more experienced escort commanders, closer coordination with aircraft, more disciplined convoy formations, more men who had survived one Atlantic crossing and knew what the next might demand. From the German side, this mattered. The U-boat crews could still attack. They could still kill. They could still find gaps. But the gaps were becoming harder to exploit. A convoy was no longer just a cluster of frightened merchant ships. It was becoming a moving defensive system. Escorts on the edges, signals between ships, aircraft overhead when available, sonar below, lookouts scanning every direction. For the U-boat commander, this changed the calculation. A torpedo attack might still succeed, but what came afterward could be deadly. The escort might turn faster. The sonar contact might hold longer. Depth charges might fall closer. Aircraft might arrive. A Wolfpack attack could still wound a convoy, but every attack now risked pulling the submarine into a more dangerous response. This is where the Canadian sailors became part of something larger than themselves. They were not fighting alone. They were part of an allied system. British ships, Canadian ships, American contributions, merchant sailors, air crews, signals intelligence, shipyards, dock workers, port cities. families waiting at home. The Atlantic War was a machine built from thousands of human lives. But inside that machine were young sailors standing on freezing decks in darkness, men listening to ASDIC returns, men rolling depth charges into black water, men trying to distinguish between wave noise, engine noise, and the sound of an enemy submarine below. The Germans learned too. They changed routes, changed tactics, changed how they approached convoys. The Atlantic remained dangerous. The Wolfpacks did not disappear because Canadian sailors improved. But the war was no longer moving only in Germany's direction. The convoy system was learning, and that learning made the ocean less friendly to the hunters beneath it. The U-boats had once faced scattered, stretched escorts and a vast ocean of possibility. Now they faced something more disciplined, more experienced, more connected, and harder to break. The escort war had changed, and beneath the water, the U-boat crews could hear that change in a single sound, ping. Inside the U-boat, the sound came again, ping, then silence, ping. Closer now. Every man inside understood what that meant. The Canadian escort above was searching, and somewhere in the black water between steel hull and ocean surface, death was being measured by sound. The submarine had come to hunt. Now it was hiding. The same ocean that had concealed it during the attack had become a prison. No open sky, no deck air, no horizon. Only pipes, gauges, sweating men, and the pressure of water pressing against steel from every side. Above, the Canadian sailors could not see the enemy. They had a contact, a suspicion, a sound return in the darkness, a possible submarine moving beneath them. That was enough to begin the attack. Depth charges were readied, set, rolled into the sea. For the men below, the waiting was almost worse than the explosion. They knew the charges were coming. They did not know where. Too far away, and the boat might live. Close enough, and machinery might break. Closer still, and the hull could open. Then the first charge exploded. The ocean slammed into the submarine. The hull shook. Lights flickered. Men fell against metal. Loose equipment crashed across the deck. Water sprayed from fittings. For a moment, the U-boat was no longer a weapon. It was a metal room being beaten by pressure. Then another charge. And another. The explosions did not have to be seen to be felt. They came through water, through steel, through bone. The submarine groaned like something alive being crushed. And inside, men listened for the sounds every submariner feared. Fluting, cracking, fire. Orders shouted too quickly. Silence where a compartment should have answered. This is the horror of depth charge warfare. On the surface, it can look technical. A ship passes over a contact. Charges drop, explosions rise. But beneath the surface, it is intimate. Human beings trapped in darkness, waiting to learn whether the sea will enter and end everything. The U-boat crew had brought death to the convoy. That must be remembered. Merchant sailors had burned, drowned, frozen, and vanished because of submarine warfare. But now the submariners were facing their own terror, not cartoon villains, not faceless machines, men inside steel. Men afraid to breathe too loudly, men waiting to see whether the next explosion would be the last. Above them, the Canadian sailors were not celebrating. They were working, listening, turning, adjusting, trying to keep contact, trying to protect the convoy, trying to make sure the submarine could not return to finish what it had started. Sometimes the U-boat escaped. Sometimes the escort lost contact. Sometimes oil rose to the surface, and men wondered what it meant. Sometimes there was wreckage. Sometimes nothing. The Atlantic was full of uncertainty. But even when a submarine survived, it had been changed. Time lost. Batteries drained. Crew shaken. Attack broken. Convoy farther away. The ocean that hid them had become the place where they could die unseen. This was the invisible war inside the Battle of the Atlantic. Canadian sailors above. German submariners below. Sound moving between them. Fear on both sides of the waterline. And somewhere beyond the explosions, the convoy kept moving. By the middle years of the Atlantic War, Germany's problem was no longer simply finding convoys, it was breaking them. The U-boats could still kill. They could still strike at night. They could still sink merchant ships and send men into freezing water. They could still make the Atlantic feel like a place where death waited beneath every wave. But the convoy system was still alive. And that was the realization Germany could not escape. The Wolfpacks had been built on a belief. that enough fear, enough loss, enough pressure, and enough tonnage sunk could break the lifeline to Britain. The submarines did not need to occupy territory. They did not need to capture cities. They only needed to make the ocean too dangerous to cross, and for a time, that threat was terrifyingly real. Convoys burned. Escorts struggled. Merchant sailors died in freezing water. Families waited for ships that never arrived. Every crossing could become a battle for survival, but the lifeline did not break. That is the center of the story. Not because the escorts were perfect. They were not. Not because the U-boats became harmless. They did not. Not because the Atlantic became safe. It never did. But because the convoys kept moving and the escorts kept returning to the black water again and again and again. From the German side, this was frustrating in a way that pure casualty numbers cannot fully explain. A U-boat could sink a ship and still fail strategically. A Wolfpack could wound a convoy and still fail to kill the lifeline. A commander could claim success at sea while the larger ocean road remained open. That was the difference between tactical destruction and strategic victory. The Canadian escorts became part of that frustration. Small ships, wet decks, exhausted crews, young sailors learning under pressure. Yet they stayed attached to the convoys. They hunted contacts. They rescued survivors when they could. They fought weather, fear, fatigue, and uncertainty. They were not glamorous. They were persistent, and persistence was exactly what the U-boat campaign could not easily defeat. The submarines needed convoys to scatter. They needed escorts to fail. They needed the Atlantic to feel too dangerous for the system to continue. But the system continued. Ships still gathered in Canadian ports. Convoys still left Halifax and other Atlantic bases. Escorts still took station. Merchant crews still crossed. For German naval command, the meaning became darker with time. The U-boats were still deadly, but they were no longer moving through the same war as before. The Allies were learning. Canadian escorts were learning. Aircraft were increasing pressure. Intelligence, signals, radar, sonar, tactics, and convoy coordination were all tightening the ocean around the submarines. This is the enemy realization. The Wolfpacks still killed, but they could not kill the lifeline. The Atlantic was still cruel, but it was no longer simply a German hunting ground. The convoy routes remained open enough for Britain to endure, for Allied power to build, and eventually for armies to cross back into Europe. The U-boats had come to strangle the Atlantic, but the escorts had turned the ocean into a fight Germany could not finish. Canada did not begin the war as a great naval giant. That is what makes this story important. At the beginning, the Royal Canadian Navy was small. The Atlantic was not. The threat was not. The responsibility was not. The ocean demanded more ships, more sailors, more training, more endurance, and more courage than Canada had expected to need so quickly. So Canada grew. Not comfortably, not perfectly, not without mistakes. It grew because the war forced it to grow. Corvettes were built. Escorts were manned. Crews trained while the battle was already underway. Young men went to sea before experience could protect them from the full weight of what the Atlantic demanded. The result was one of the most dramatic transformations in Canadian military history. A small navy became a major escort force in the Battle of the Atlantic. Canadian ships helped guard the convoys. Canadian sailors faced U-boats, storms, ice, mechanical breakdowns, exhaustion, and the constant uncertainty of an enemy that might already be beneath them. This was Canada's war before many of the famous land battles entered memory. Before Juno Beach, before the Scheldt, before the liberation of the Netherlands, before Canadian troops could fight across Europe, the ocean road had to remain open, and Canadian sailors helped keep it open. That does not mean Canada did it alone. It did not. The Battle of the Atlantic was a vast Allied effort. British ships, Canadian ships, American support, merchant sailors, air crews, signals intelligence, dock workers, shipyards, convoy planners, countless people whose names rarely appear in popular stories of the war. But coalition war does not erase national contribution. It reveals it. And Canada's contribution at sea became enormous because the convoy lifeline passed through Canadian geography, Canadian ports, Canadian ships, and Canadian crews. This is why the sailors matter. Not as symbols, as men. Men standing watch in freezing spray. Men sleeping in cramped spaces when sleep was possible. Men listening to sonar returns in darkness. Men loading depth charges with cold hands. Men seeing burning ships and knowing there might be survivors in the water. Men forced to make impossible choices between rescue, pursuit, and convoy protection. The U-boats tested them again and again. The Atlantic tested them every hour. And still the convoys moved. That is the final proof. Not one perfect victory. Not one clean battle. Not one glorious moment that explains everything. 1,000 crossings. 1,000 watches. 1,000 nights when sailors listened for a sound beneath the water and stayed at their stations anyway. Canada's Navy became an Atlantic force because the war gave it no other choice. And by becoming that force, Canadian sailors helped keep Britain supplied, helped protect merchant shipping, and helped make the later return to Europe possible. That is why this story belongs beside Canada's more famous battles. Because before victory could come on land, survival had to be won at sea. Before armies could cross Europe, ships had to cross the Atlantic. And before those ships could arrive, Canadian sailors had to face the Wolfpacks in the dark. Return to the Black Atlantic, night, wind, cold water moving beneath a sky without mercy. A convoy moving slowly through darkness. A Canadian escort rising and falling beside it. And somewhere below, the possibility of a U-boat. This was Canada's war at sea, not clean, not simple, not filled with easy glory. A war of cold hands, wet decks, sleepless watches, bad weather, broken machinery, and men listening for an enemy they could not see. The U-boats entered the Atlantic believing the ocean could belong to them. They believed darkness could hide them. They believed convoys could be broken. They believed Britain's lifeline could be strangled beneath the waves. And for a time, the threat was real enough to terrify the world. But the convoys kept moving. The escorts kept sailing. The ships kept crossing. The ocean road remained open enough for Britain to survive and for Allied strength to grow. The Canadian sailors who fought there were not invincible. They were not untouched by fear. They were young men in small ships on a violent ocean, facing submarines, storms, and uncertainty. Some came home, some did not. Some disappeared into the Atlantic, leaving only names, records, and memory. That is why this story must be remembered carefully, not as a myth that Canada won the Atlantic alone. It did not, but as a truth that Canada helped keep the lifeline alive. Canadian sailors stood between the Wolfpacks and the convoys, between Britain and starvation, between Europe and the supplies needed to return. The Germans hunted the convoy lanes. The Wolfpacks brought fire, fear, and death from beneath the waves. But Canada helped answer them with small ships, tired crews, sonar pings, depth charges, and stubborn endurance. The Atlantic did not remember speeches. It remembered ships, sailors, storms, convoys, and the men who kept moving through darkness because stopping was not an option. Somewhere beneath the Black Atlantic, the sonar still seems to echo. Ping, then silence. Ping,